All right, here we go. We're going live. All right, welcome back to the After Action Project. This is episode 11. Tonight we are with William Aprill. He's our instructor, and Scott Mitchell is the student. So we'll do the obligatory disclaimer for everybody. While we're doing that, feel free to share this up with your friends and family, your loved ones, and those few enemies that you might have. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual co-hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Firearms Radio Network and or their employers. Viewer discretion is advised. This is especially true on live shows. And was I the only one that was picking up a little bit of an echo there?
I heard a little one.
Get that figured out, hopefully. So what's everybody drinking tonight? I see Judson, you have something in a cup or a koozie. Scott, you have something going on over there?
I'm actually drinking a Rudy Ska IPA. It's a session IPA. It's one of my favorite beers. And me being located here in Durango, where it's made, I can get it on tap, which most people can't.
All right.
I'm also supporting my local economy by drinking a local IPA.
Sweet.
We'll have to compare notes when you come down, Justin.
Absolutely. I'll be down there next weekend.
Yeah, next week and teaching an instructor course, right?
Correct.
Awesome. So this is episode 11 of the After Action Project. Tonight we're bringing you into the student seat of William Aprill's Unthinkable seminar, a seminar that delves into the world and thoughts of violent criminal actors. Your hosts are Judson Crossland of Silver Mountain Instruction, Andy Montoya of Practical Defense Training, and I'm Jeremy Gill. William Aprill is the instructor, and Scott Mitchell joins us as a student this week. Many of you may recognize Scott from episode 3. So, William, can you talk to us about your journey to teaching the Unthinkable seminar, how you got started in training, and how you became a subject matter expert on violent criminal actors?
Well, it was kind of my two longstanding professional interests came together. A long time ago, I was in law enforcement for a relatively short time. But when I got finished with that, I realized I didn't want to do it as a career. I went back to school and later on to graduate school in first social work and then psychology. And I've been practicing in mental health ever since for about 20 years now. And since I could speak cop and since I could speak mental health, I wound up in this weird area where mental health and the court systems overlap, doing a bunch of different kinds of work, especially early in my career working almost exclusively in addictive disorders. I came across people that were involved in the court systems and it just grew from there. I started taking training. I got lucky. The first formal training class I ever took was Masad Ayoub's, at then time called LFI-1, and it was just great training right off the bat. And it sort of really put the hook in me about getting really top level training in self-defense and self-protection issues. Whereas before, I just, like most dudes, I just figured I knew how to do it. And eventually, I got asked by Mast if I would teach a block on post-traumatic stress disorder at one of his courses, and I started out teaching part-time for people, just as a way of pitching in to instructors that I really believed in, and it wound up being a full-time job.
I can definitely relate. I kind of sort of have gone through that same journey. Scott, I'm going to kick it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the self-defense training in the industry and whatnot?
Yeah, I started out as like everybody does as a practitioner, and the more I studied and more I got into it, it just kind of naturally evolved into teaching. I was fortunate enough to have an instructor early on when I started getting serious about defensive pistol who clued me into the fact that if you don't have empty hand skills, if you're relying on a pistol as your only tool, you're really, you're missing it, right? And that got me going down the empty hand path. And, if you look at this honestly, and you look at the number of scenarios in which, the firearm is going to be the best choice and the justifiable choice, empty hand stuff starts looking more and more feasible and realistic. And so got into that with great zeal and became a black belt in multiple Krav Maga systems, and continued to do that. And it's I found it to be a good marriage, and it's nice to be able to offer multiple perspectives to my students. So.
Yeah, so speaking of, you being a Krav Maga black belt, multiple black belt, right? You're also the owner of Duke City Krav Maga, which like we said, you were on our episode 3 podcast. You hosted William April's seminar here the last time here in Albuquerque. What made you want to be a student also as well as host this course? What'd you get out of it?
Well, the subject matter is infinitely valuable, not just from a personal perspective, but teaching self-defense, being able to understand some of the psychology and the mentality around the threats that people are training to deal with. It's a nice augmentation to the subject matter. And I actually traveled to Phoenix to take William's course, and was really riveted. I was blown away. I could have listened to 2 more days. I went for 2 days. I could have easily done 2 more. It's the presentation is really fantastic, and the material is fantastic. William's very easy to listen to. It's not. It certainly isn't boring, right? It'll definitely keep you awake. In more ways than one, might keep you awake at night after you take the course. But it was so well done that when he had an availability and we were able to bring him to Albuquerque, it was really a no-brainer. I felt it was a good thing to do for not just our students, but our community, to bring him in. So we're very lucky to get that done this year.
And one of the things that I think is important is it isn't just a sort of, here's the bad guys and isn't this awful sort of talk. Especially the second half of the day is pretty explicitly trying to draw the comparison between, hey, this is violent criminal actors and how they're wired and how they respond. And what are you like? How are you wired? How do you respond? How was your upbringing? Basically, we're trying to get at that moment where the two of you meet and the two worldviews and the two sets of preparations meet. When people are kind of distressed by the course, and every now and again there are people who are, it's because of the reflection they've done about themselves, not about sort of the boogeyman violent criminal actor that's got them so freaked out, but it's the introspection that I think has the most value, and the course is really aimed to produce that.
So, William, since I've got you talking there, how long is that course?
It's about 9 hours. Yeah, it's about 9 hours, the one-day version.
Okay.
As I put it, a long 8 hours.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I tell people with my concealed carry class, because it's a 9-hour class or a long 8-hour class. Yeah. What's the format of it? I mean, how does that how do you fill that long 8 hours?
It's a kind of an interactive multimedia presentation. Do a lot of PowerPoint, a lot of short video clips, lots of things gathered from the literature, but also from popular media, and lots of interactive lecture. We're trying to get people's opinions and experiences, and trying to get the class to contribute, because 8 hours of straight lecture, that's a tough sell for anyone.
Yeah, it was
Absolutely.
It was 8.5 hours, and then there was a kind of a bonus training session that William does. And I can tell you from the students' perspective, got there a little bit early, and the next thing I know, we're breaking for lunch at right around 1 o'clock. So even though it's a 8.5 hour, 9 hour course, it just flies by. And William does. I want to attest to it. William does a great job keeping everybody engaged and taking a subject matter that could be easily presented in a dry and boring manner, making it really fun and easy to stay engaged with the content. So it was 8.5 hours that I was there for, but it was an easy 8.5. And like Scott said, I probably could have sat. I would have easily sat for another 8.5, 9 hours, because that's how good the material was presented.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Well, that's a long class if it was 18 or 19 hours. I don't know if I could go through that much, but it sounds really interesting. You know, I was going to take this class, but I took a long, like 40-hour driving trip with Mr. Judson over there. Thanks to Judson, by the way. But, you know, usually we break up these classes, you know, into sections, first half, second half. So William, what does it look like for the first half of class? What do you get involved with there? Is it just kind of basically explaining what a criminal looks like?
No, the first half is about victim selection, or is the term we like to use is target selection, because it's actually a pretty involved process, and we go from the ground up to talk about how rapid decision making under pressure is done by anyone, and then get very specifically into how violent criminal actors pick who's going to be the target of their aggression, and most importantly, who they unpick. So the first half of the day is pretty much exclusively about target selection. The back half of the day is about the psychological development, the psychosocial development of violent criminal actors. Basically, how do you take someone from birth to being a monster? But it's like I said, it's really an opportunity that we want to have the class members exploring internally and hopefully externally what they're like in comparison. As I often say in the class, we're going to talk about the speed of the game, but it's up to you to assess your own ability to play at that speed, because the world doesn't make allowances for our inability to play the game at the speed. So we talk quite a bit about how violent criminal actors are made, so to speak, but with the goal of getting people to assess where they are and where they need to change.
Yeah, a matter of personal awareness, right? So give us an example of a common victim, would you say? Give us an example that you talk about.
Well, I think the kind of thing that I find most sad and most common is people apply their own standards of what's even something like at risk, my own standard of at risk. And what that often comes down to, unfortunately, is if I wouldn't steal it, then it's not easily stolen. Or if I wouldn't take advantage of that person, then no one else would either. But not thinking that the person who's making those judgments has an entirely separate perception of the world and an entirely separate decision-making process. We can't use our eyes to see their world. And it's very, very hard to get people who haven't been victimized to look through the eyes of a victimizer, especially at themselves, and say, what would a violent criminal actor looking at me decide? So it's the inability to take perspective that I think is the biggest pitfall, the biggest trap that most normal, nice, regular people fall into.
Yeah, on that note, you know, we talk often in our classes about, you know, keep your head up, look around, you know, keep yourself off your phone, you know, don't be the person that's showing a bunch of bling, et cetera, et cetera. So just a kind of a dumb question for me. Do you really think that many criminals really look in and study a victim? Or do you think, you know, sometimes it can just be a random, hey, there's somebody, boom, I'm going to hit that person? Which do you think more often is the case?
It's actually somewhere in between. What interests me is we're all very good at global decision making. You know, I often say, if you had a new student on the pistol range, let's say, if you had them, you know, address a target, draw, fire one round, and holster, you could probably make a pretty good snap judgment about whether you'd have to keep an eye on that person. Are they safe or are they dangerous? But just because it's snap judgment doesn't mean that the knowledge that went into it is scant. It's actually all of your knowledge that goes into that decision. And the same thing is true of a violent criminal actor looking at a target. He may make a snap judgment, meaning that it happens very quickly in time, but it's all of his previous experience boiled down to that one question, yes or no, good victim, bad victim. So it seems like it's happening fast, but that's because it's the last chapter of a pretty long book.
That makes plenty of sense.
It's very well said.
Jeremy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have a follow-up for for William. So when I teach my classes, when I'm to and from the range, I'm typically wearing what I'm wearing right now because I was teaching today. I volunteer with a bunch of middle schoolers and teaching firearm safety and whatnot. To and from the range, I've got my 511 pants on, my patch hat, and my patches on my shirts and everything with all that. That's my uniform, so to speak. Is that something that you find as being becoming like that person that looks like the victim, because I would be like the first target, so to speak? Or is that something that would be a deterrence? Because I get a lot of people, I mean, some people make fun of me for it. It's actually a big joke in some of my arenas, but what's your take on that? Like gun stickers on your car and, maybe Smith & Wesson is protecting this house kind of sign in front of your house. What's your take on something like that?
My feeling is that those are markers that there's something valuable to be taken. I wouldn't put a gun sticker on my car any more than I'd put a sticker on my car that said Rolex, or any other kind of expensive consumer good. Guns and drugs are the only things in the world that are worth more illegally than legally. So telling someone you have a high value item probably in your car or certainly in your house, that just doesn't strike me as a good idea. I think it's fair to say that tactical clothing and, let's say, branded clothing for knife manufacturers, gun manufacturers, stuff like that, it certainly isn't dissuasive. It certainly isn't turning anyone off. I remember reading some years ago on a forum something that truly boggled the mind. It was a sort of an after-action report by a guy who had been involved in an act of criminal predation that he was able to sort of stave off by having a gun. And in this little weird AAR, he said that he couldn't believe that the person had carried through with the attack, even though he was wearing his gun sight cap. Well, if you think somebody's going to take your gun sight cap and go running wee into the woods, that's a little ridiculous. Now, it doesn't mean that tactical clothing isn't noticed. But what they may very well get from the tactical clothing is that you're a cop. And that's not necessarily the kind of attention that we want, because it's going to draw more attention, because if they think you might be a cop, they have to look at you well enough to decide whether you are or not. And that they're going to get, again, through observing those what we call diffuse status characteristics, little things like carrying two wallets or wearing a chain around your neck that a badge might be suspended from, things like that. So it's certainly not scaring anyone away, and it can bring on all kinds of unwanted attention. I'm not sure it's a great idea in any way you slice it.
Okay, thank you.
So we should stop marketing our branded apparel as crime deterrents.
Yeah,
Duly noted.
Really is. In 1 year that I tracked it in 2015, 6 open carriers that I was able to find were robbed of their guns here in my hometown, here in my beloved New Orleans. And what's becoming increasingly common, I'm tracking it this year, is robberies of security guards, robberies of uniformed security personnel, where the aim of the robbery is to get the gun. They're basically using armed security personnel at drugstores and Walmarts and things like that as a glorified holster. They'll attack them, rat pack them, take their guns. So the gun isn't scaring anybody away.
That's kind of surprising, because we see a lot on social media, the anti-concealed carry people, where they say, well, I'm going to open carry because I want people to know I have a gun, and I want them to be able to be afraid that I have a gun and they won't mess with me. And that we see that kind of often. So that's a really good point that you made there, that, just because you have a gun on your hip doesn't mean you're not going to ever be a victim.
No, I often say that unless if you're in some crazy jurisdiction where you cannot carry concealed and open carry is your only choice other than go unarmed, well, then yeah, sure. But Mass Ayub has written at length about, there are better and smarter ways to do it if you're forced to do it. But if you're not forced to do it and you choose to anyway, that's almost always for reasons that have nothing to do with self-defense. People are making political statements. They're making statements about intimidation, just a bunch of statements that frankly aren't super duper healthy or productive, I don't think.
So Scott, why should the responsibly armed citizen know and understand how violent criminal actors choose their targets, in your opinion?
Well, William kind of nailed this earlier. People, in my experience, have a tendency to apply their rules to the world, right? They think that everybody's playing by the same playbook. An example might be, people avoid a dark alley, right? Don't go down that alley because you're liable to get mugged or raped or whatever, right? Well, they think that because that's where they would mug somebody. That's where they would rape somebody, out of view, right? And if they don't, if you grew up in a way that doesn't teach you or sometimes force you to learn how to read people and read cues about behavior, you can be pretty flippant, right? You can insult people. You can operate in a way that is, for lack of a better term, kind of clueless, right? And understanding this material and getting a view into this other world and the perspective coming back at you is just another tool to help you operate more safely in the world. A lot of people just don't understand what they're putting out day to day when they're operating out in the world. And this helps at least, shed some light on some of this behavior that, is likely to, or maybe more likely to get somebody selected or deselected for that matter.
We've all seen that person who's doing something embarrassing in their car, because when people are in their cars, they have this weird notion that they're somehow invisible. But the car is just a manifestation of a lot of people's mindset. They don't realize walking around in the world that you're bleeding information into the environment, sort of like drop a tea bag in the hot water and this sort of tea leaches out in this way that doesn't seem terribly dramatic, but you're shipping information about yourself all the time. Violent criminal actors make their decisions about you based on the information you give them. And so, knowing how you come across and how that information is going to be processed, I think is really, really important.
Scott, when you actually took the seminar, did you have any preconceived notions about victimology and that kind of thing that were either enforced or contradicted by the Unthinkable seminar?
Yeah, both. I mean, some of the things that I understood or believed were reinforced, and other things were really kind of upended. I think one of the common myths that this seminar really shatters for me, and I know other people have made the same comment. It's very easy to color, paint violent criminals with the same brush, right? They're crazy, right? Or they're this or they're that, right? These notions that we have about them being irrational, acting on the spur of the moment, mentally ill, these things largely are untrue, right? But it's easier, I think, for people to put this sort of activity in that box. It makes them feel more comfortable, right? It's an uncomfortable idea to think that somebody who's capable of committing, heinous acts against another human being is doing it in a very rational and sane way, right? They're just looking at it from a different perspective. Their ethics, their right and wrong, their morality is there. It's just completely different from ours. And that's one of the big takeaways I think that I got, but I think other people get that as well, right? It blows that out of the water. This notion that we're just dealing with a fringe group of crazies, right? And they're acting completely impulsively. I like to tell people that that term, when we use the term random, crime, random violence, right? Well, it's only random to the victim, right? The perpetrator wasn't random to him at all.
No, that's a perfect point, because I think the danger is corollary to thinking that, oh, they're crazy, right? They're just completely crazy and completely alien to us. Well, that kind of, I hate to use a PC term, but that kind of othering, what it does is it makes them seem unknowable, that they're unknowable and therefore unpredictable. And nothing could be further from the truth. They're very knowable and actually pretty predictable once you can get rid of the notion that they're operating from some bizarre, outer space or insane viewpoint. They're not.
What are your guys' thoughts? I'm of the opinion that society, people in general, like to put labels on criminals and kind of put them in that box where they're mentally ill, because it kind of takes the responsibility off of us, and to accept the fact that, the guy that rents a hotel room and just rains down terror on people, he isn't crazy. He's the day before, for all intents and purposes, he was a pretty normal guy. So what are your guys' thoughts on that? That, because that's one of the opinions that I hold is that we like to classify people because it lets us have this false sense of security and safety.
I think that's a perfect point, because in terms of activities of daily living, putting clothes on, having breakfast, walking around, lots of people that are able to do things that are truly horrifying aren't any different than any of us. They put their pants on one leg at a time and all that sort of stuff, exactly the way we do. But that if we think of them as having to be completely unhinged in order to do something that we can't contemplate, then we don't spend any more time thinking about them. We say, well, they're just crazy and there's no predicting crazy and there's no point thinking about it. That takes this entire realm of knowledge that we have about ourselves and puts it off limits. It's saying we just can't know anything about this, so there's no point thinking about it. But I think, I don't know, that old Sun Tzu quote keeps coming back. If you know your enemy and you know yourself, you won't be in peril in 100 battles. I don't know if that's true about 100 battles, but knowing yourself, especially how you compare to people that can do things that are just unthinkable, that you literally can't contemplate. That time spent exploring that is never lost time. It's always valuable, because otherwise we're giving up an inquiry into something that we really do need to understand.
Yeah, I want to bring up a couple good points that you talked about there, just listening to you. Man, I wish I would have got to this seminar, and I'm looking forward to it next year. But a couple things you said, a lot of people that are, they're in their cars and for some reason, they think they're invisible in their cars. And, same goes for people with sunglasses. I see this all the time. When somebody puts on a pair of sunglasses, it seems like to them that they're invisible, or they think they're invisible. And again, talk about this in class. You have a freeway and one lane is closing. Everybody's merging and you're the one trying to merge, and you put your turn signal on and you look over to the person to the next to you to kind of give them an eye contact to be like, hey, I'd like to get over. And they put their head down and they kind of avoid you. Like, if I don't look at you, you don't see me kind of thing. You know what I mean? Which is kind of funny. And, on top of that, the type of criminal we're talking about, if you look at Scott, mohawk, tattoos on his arms. I got tattoos, bald headed. Sometimes I think we got to look in beyond the facade of a criminal, right? And actually actions. And so moving on to that, with like social media, what would you say, William, and Scott too? You can add whatever you'd like on this. What are some bad advice, opinions to self-defense, or like for the example, oh, that guy looks scary because he has tattoos on his head or he has a mohawk kind of thing? What are some bad advice, opinions that you hear?
Well, the worst thing that I'm thinking of in terms of victimization for social media is this insane habit people have of sharing that they're going to be out of town. That simply blows my mind. Hey, can't wait to spend the next 2 weeks in Greece. Why don't you just, put a sign in front of your house? Please rob me. I just don't get that. If you're that into social media, announce it when you come home. Not before you leave. But no, you make an excellent point, which is thinking that you know what a typical person who puts you at risk looks like means that that's all you're looking for. If you're looking for, a young black male, well, then you're not going to see a young Latina girl, let's say, even though she may pose a risk to you. So we want to look for traits and behavior, not demographic sweet spots. Thinking that you know what a typical anything looks like is very dangerous, and we go over that in pretty great length in the course, actually.
Yeah, I actually totally 150% agree with. I mean, when my wife actually she takes groups of middle school kids to third world and other countries and Galapagos Islands and Costa Rica and New Zealand, and every summer she takes middle school kids on these trips, and they actually instead of saying, hey, check out this sea turtle that we just got to swim with, they on their public pages, they actually go in and create private what do you call them, secret or closed groups on Facebook, and all the families join it, and then they post stuff to that page to where the families can see it, but nobody else in the public knows. So that's such a good point that you make there.
Yeah, exactly. There are ways to sort of neaten up your social media presence. I'm also unnerved by people who, they'll say, look at my new, Maxi Blaster 5000, and over their shoulder is an open safe full of ARs and, expensive shotguns and things like that. That's giving away information that puts you at risk. I'm not a big fan of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, an example that I use is that people can relate to. You remember the movie Falling Down, Michael Douglas? Mm-hmm. Right? He's squared away, flat top, button-down shirt, tie, right? People do tend to fixate on their stereotype, right? Especially when they're becoming, situationally aware, right? There's a kid in baggy clothes with his ball cap turned around backwards or sideways, right? And that becomes the object of their fixation. And they don't notice Mr. Squarejaw superhero, who comes in with a gun in his hand. So it's important not to stereotype, and I think another mistake that people make with social media is they really throw off a lot of incendiary posts, right? They can be very inflammatory. They can get very emotional, and they do things online that they would never do face to face, right? Or at least if they did it face to face with somebody, they would expect, that they might get corrected, right? There might be a corrective action that takes place, and so they kind of operate with impunity in terms of not just the information they put out there, but the way they're delivering it, as if there's never going to be any consequence.
Yeah, you see this kind of weird bleed through from the online world, the social media world, to to IRL, right, in real life world. And you're starting to see some pretty bad social consequences. There was a shooting here in Walgreens drugs, of all things. A clerk got into it with a customer, and the clerk tweeted to her boyfriend that the customer was giving her grief. The boyfriend came to the store and shot the customer. That was kind of real life amplified by social media, turned back into real life. I mean, you don't think that when you have crosswords with a clerk that you're actually putting yourself at risk. But that's the power of social media.
Yeah. So Scott, let me ask you a question. Before you took the Unthinkable seminar, what questions did you have that you wanted to get answered, and were those questions answered?
Yeah, and a lot more questions were created. I've been interested in the psychology around what we do, since I started doing it, and listening to William and taking his course, it was really the first opportunity I got to sit with a professional, an expert in this area, who is also involved in, this business that we're all involved in. I grew up with violence, at home and everywhere else. So I learned to read cues from people very early on in my life. Because it's how you avoided, a beating, simply put. But it's something that's hard to articulate. And I don't know. There's something about reading books and other resources that just don't, at least to me, didn't translate as well as listening to William. Because he is not only the real world experience, but also, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, his way of delivering it is something that is very relatable and understandable, and it's put into a context that I think the people that are attending his seminar, that's the context that they're thinking, and that's the context that they're wondering about. And so, I definitely have a much better understanding of a number of things after taking the course. And I've taken the course twice. I'll take it a third time. It's you're going to glean more every single time.
Oh, thank God. That's that house payment. That's the house payment. No, but a point you make is that a lot of people come from backgrounds that have given them sort of ground level understanding of two of the 2 points that I try to make very strongly are that what people tend to dismiss as intuition or gut feelings, things like that, are really a baked in part of our evolutionary heritage. We're really, really good at threat detection and behavior prediction. We're really, really good at it, just as a virtue of evolution. We're all the product of genetic winners, and those traits helped our ancestors be genetic winners. But then some of us have upbringings that bring those skills to the fore. Learning how to avoid a beating as a young person teaches you a lot about how do you get around people's moods, how do you shade your behavior to be ignored. So that's that street level awareness of threat detection and behavior prediction. But there's the flip side. I really didn't have any experience of violence growing up. Right, I was lucky enough to have a nice upbringing, nice family, until I got a job as a sheriff's deputy working in one of the worst prisons in America, and I was thrown into the deep end. It was horrifying, and I kind of barely kept my nose above water. So I would rather have had the childhood that I had, but then again, at the same time, it also cost me something. It cost me that awareness until I took that job that people are not nice, and they're frequently not nice. So there's something to have been gained by even really some kind of traumatic upbringings for sure.
Yeah, I can relate with that also too, is what Scott said. Me and my wife were actually talking about this over this past weekend because she works at a very high-end makeup store, and they have upwards of 20 employees at sometimes, and especially right now around Christmas, theft is huge. And she was telling me, she's like, it amazes me sometimes that these employees of mine, they don't even see what's going on. And I said, well, you and I, we grew up basically in the hood. We grew up poor. Like Scott says, you learn those keys at a very young age. Hey, there's trouble there. I'm going to go this way. Or, hey, something's about to happen over there. You know what? I'm going to avoid that area. So, William, I'd be interested in, when you have a student like yourself who said you had a really good upbringing to where you weren't really exposed to that, how do you bring that on to a student that's sitting in your class that's just never experienced something like that?
It's very hard because none of us. I mean, nobody in the self-protection business wants their students to get hurt. I mean, that's the opposite of why we're interested in self-protection, and certainly in the business of self-protection, of training and teaching. But it's sometimes is a kind of wisdom that can only be paid for with pain. I wish that weren't the case, but it is. But the funny thing is the clerks that you're talking about, the employees that you're talking about, they don't notice what's going on because it would never cross their mind to steal. So they don't look for the openings. They don't look for the potentials that somebody who would steal sees. It's not that they can't see, it's that they don't see. If you can't conceive of doing it, by and large, you can't conceive of someone else doing it. So you've got to knowledge where even if I can't see myself doing it, I can absolutely and clearly see a reality where someone else would see it and someone else would do it.
If you could narrow the seminar down to a single piece of knowledge or two that was the most beneficial to you, what would it be?
I always say that the takeaway in my mind from the first half of the day is you're being targeted. The reasonable expectation when you walk out the front door is that you are being targeted. You're putting off information that somebody without your best interest at heart is gathering data about you and interpreting that data. That doesn't mean that they're aggressing against you, but that the expectation should be when I walk out the front door, I am being targeted. And so that I want people to start banking on that and starting to try and use it against violent criminal actors. Start shipping information that helps you be deselected, not selected. And for the second half of the day, I would say the kind of single takeaway message is you have to be able to get down because you have to be able to fight hard enough on demand to save your life, in conflict with someone intent on taking it. And that's hard for nice people to get used to. The notion that I might have to do truly horrific things to survive today, that's a hard place for nice people to go. And so we spend the second half of the day really trying to work on that.
Absolutely, I agree. Scott, what about you? What is, if you could narrow it down to one piece of advice or one or two pieces of knowledge most beneficial to you, what would it be?
Well, one of them is certainly what William just alluded to, right? What he calls the mindset without a delivery system is a great example that he gives, in a video. If you have two people and all things are equal, right? And if you look at it like a race, one person floors it when the light turns green, and the other person has to kind of, ease down on the gas and do it gradually. Well, it's obvious who's going to win, right? And understanding that, in a situation, whether it's an ambush, a surprise attack, or an encounter that you see coming, you're participating in, but you kind of don't have any control over. If you don't go right to 10, you're in trouble. If you're defending, by definition, you're losing. You have to be, as William just said, you have to be able to get down. You have to go all out. And it doesn't matter if it's empty hands or hell, if it's running, if it's the Nike defense, you better be going all out, right? You hear this all the time in the self-defense world. Well, run away if you can. Well, you better be damn sure you can outrun that guy if that's your choice, right? And obviously you can't have anybody with you that can't keep up. So it's really rewiring the brain, I think, to think and look at these things in a much different light. And the more training you get, I think this course is able to present things in a clear fashion that we can't always articulate, right? We tell people all the time, I don't know if you guys do, you probably do, but I tell people in both my firearms classes and empty hands classes that when you train, when you study this stuff, when you really take an interest in it, and do it seriously, you start to throw off a different kind of heat, right? You operate differently in the world, and the more you train, the less likely you are to be involved in something. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The physical consequences, right? After you've, been hit in the face a few times, okay, well, that's not abstract anymore like it used to be. But you start to understand the legal ramifications. And you take a course like Williams, and you see some of the worst potential outcomes, and you see ways to avoid it. And so all of this training just makes you safer. And it's so hard to articulate, kind of on the fly in a class, but in a seminar like this, you start to really get an understanding of why that is, right? This, like William said, not shipping information that you're not the person to be messed with, instead of the opposite.
The late trainer Paul Gomez once said that nice people don't get aggressive enough fast enough. That they may do the right thing, but they have to ramp up into it, and they may be behind. Well, that isn't just in self-protection. There are all kinds of fields where people don't get intense enough quickly enough. I'll never remember the first time I ever had to take CPR somewhere. The nurse who was teaching the class said, "Press harder than you think, press faster than you think." She said people tend to just sort of to be nice about it, and there's nothing nice about it. Putting pressure on serious bleeding. You put maximum pressure right off the bat. You don't ramp up into it. So in terms of life-saving practices, it is interesting that people do sort of ease into it. Well, violent criminal actors are not easing into it. They're starting at 100 in hopes of cutting off any hope of resistance right up front.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, to segue, or not to segue, but to just, I guess it is kind of a segue, but I just taught a group of middle schoolers today, where today was a run, hide, fight kind of day. And we're teaching them, if the bad guy's in the other room, you try to run if you can. If you can't run, you hide. And if the bad guy comes to you, you have to fight. And one of the slides I have in that little presentation, and we did a bunch of practicals and had the kids get up and run around and do stuff. But one of the slides I have in there is right after the fight, when I explain what that is and use anything possible, fire extinguishers, laptops, cell phones, throw everything you can to the guy. The next slide says, if you have to fight, it should be the most violent day of your life. It's maximum effort, 100%, the most violent day of your life. I teach the same. No, that's a good point. Yeah, I teach the same thing in my concealed carry classes. If you have to pull it out, it's going to be the most violent day of your life.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting way to put it. I have to say I agree with that.
Kind of wrap it all up. Mindset. We've got to get into that mindset to be able to ramp up to 100, 0 to 100 immediately. Have the mindset to know, look, you know what, this will be the fight of my life. This isn't an ease into it, hopefully this guy goes away and stops kind of thing. Get down and dirty, develop that mindset. I think that's pretty much how it kind of wraps it all up into one, in my opinion. So, William, in your opinion, where should this fall into like the continuum of training for like a gun owner or a self-defense person? Where do you think this should fall as far as importance?
Well, as the person who does the class, I think everyone should take it. Everyone, everywhere. 330 million customers. That's what I need.
Right.
But no, I think pretty early on the continuum of development. But what I found is that both individual practitioners have to be more mature. What I mean by mature isn't necessarily older, but that further along in the process, because we've all walked through the path, right? At first you're obsessed with stuff, with gear, and then you sort of realize, geez, I need to know some more different kinds of things. So yeah, people tend to kind of come to me later in their developmental cycle, and also groups of students tend to come later in their developmental cycle. Like Scott brought together a great group of students at Duke City Crop. I mean, it was a great bunch of students, but they're later in their developmental process. They've done some guns, they've done some hands-on, and they're like, okay, I need that other kind of keystone in the arch that I'm building, right? So yeah, more mature student body, a more mature student base tends to kind of be ready for this. but I also think there's a great blend. I mean, I love when couples come to class, because a lot of times a couple tends to have someone in the couple who's more serious about self-protection than the other. And having them both have the common experience of understanding the criminal mindset really helps, because it underscores the seriousness of it, but also it says to the to the one who's perhaps not as much into it, geez, I wish you could catch up with your spouse, with your significant other, in how seriously we take this.
So asking for a friend, if you're still hungry for gear and stuff a lot, like patches, but you're still hungry for training, is that okay? Again, asking
Of
for a friend,
course.
and his name is Judson.
You, Andy.
That's a great point. We took a trip over to Flagstaff this last weekend, and on the way there, I usually listen to a podcast down there, and my wife was giving me a hard time. She was like, I don't like listening to your podcast. So I said, all right, cool. I'm not much of a talker, so we talked most of the way down there, and a good bit of that conversation was the talking to her about some of the stuff that I learned in the seminar. And the whole time I'm thinking, it's like, man, I got to get her into this seminar. So William, Scott, you guys will probably meet my wife when you're back in town in 2018. I think we got her on the hook to do some maybe some intermediate training, handgun training as well.
Great.
So
I hate to get on a rant, because but a lot of times I think gun people fail the other people in our lives, because we insist on making them into little gun people. When somebody comes and says, hey, there's this guy, I mean, let's face it, for folks like you and for a whole lot of your listeners, for the people in your lives, you're SEAL Team 6. You know more about guns and self-protection than they ever will in a lifetime. So they come to you for advice. And where people like us tend to fall down is we immediately start talking about stuff that they're not ready to do. They come and say, hey, I'm a little worried about this guy in my office. He's creepy and he followed me out to my car once. We say, great, what kind of gun do you want? Well, that's a country mile from where they are. We need to talk about what can you do to be safer. And I mean rock bottom basics, things they'll actually do. We want them to be safer, not to be little gun people covered in Molly, right? So, we have this great responsibility because they are going to come to us, and we need to be good stewards of that. That's my rant.
that's a great point, because that is, that's you see it all the time. It's, hey, this guy might be creepy. Well, let's get you in this AR-15 class and this handgun class and all this other stuff, and
they're out the door the second you say that. They're not going to do it, and so we tend to go, well, then fine.
Yeah, as an instructor, one of the questions I get often is, does your wife carry? Does she train? And it's one of those. As an instructor, I have that kind of oversight where you have the husband and the wife coming in, and the wife or the husband, one of the two is there reluctantly, and then the other one is the all-knowing coach, and that tends to make things difficult for that new shooter. So as an instructor, one of the things that I've been really challenging myself on is easing not just my wife but other people into that role of a responsibly armed citizen, and taking that the responsibility for their safety and protection, kind of easing them into that mindset, because it's super easy to turn people off to this lifestyle, because we're already labeled as the paranoid gun nut, right? And we have this fantasy of stopping the mall attacker or this, that, or the other.
Exactly. But if you're sort of building a constellation of protective skills, right? Like emergency medical management skills, right? How do you stop bleeding? How do you do CPR? How do you run a fire extinguisher? At that point, in Mass's favorite expression, at that point, the gun is just another piece of safety rescue equipment. But if it's the only thing that you're into because guns are really cool, well, then you just do seem like a weirdo. But if it's one more piece of safety rescue equipment in this constellation of protective behaviors, these are the things that help us live longer. These are the things that mean we won't die if somebody chokes on a piece of food, right? Then it makes sense. It's got kind of face validity. But if we're not careful, it just seems like we want them to be into guns because we're into guns and guns are fun and cool. And that's not a very compelling sales pitch for people that aren't already into guns. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So, William, a sentiment that both Scott and I had is that this seminar could have easily been 16 hours. How did you decide what information to present? How did you boil that information down into a 9-hour or 8.5-hour seminar?
Well, it's it started out as a 16-hour class, and I found that people that find their way in my classes would rather be overwhelmed than bored. I found that people would rather be overwhelmed than bored, and so I started shortening them and shortening them and shortening them, and I got to the point where when they went from 8 hours to 4 hours, that people had to sort of run to keep up, and that kept everybody on their toes and kept it more interesting. And it's more interesting to do, and I hope it's more interesting to take part in because it's more information dense. So yeah, it was just a way of getting across as much material as I could in a way that made it palatable. I mean, believe me, I'm the first to admit 8 hours in a classroom is a lot. So classroom management has to be pretty important.
Silence is such a good thing on podcasts.
Yeah.
I will ask.
Don't
tell
edit
me
that down.
So,
Wait, I can do a dog.
who's the? Yeah, exactly. Who's the violent criminal actor that is the point of reference in the Unthinkable seminar?
Well, one of the things that we go through is that there's a difference between violent criminal actors that are made. What I mean by that is somebody doesn't necessarily have the genes to be a sociopath or a psychopath in the ways that we define them in the class. Excuse me, but is made by virtue of their experience of the world. They're basically trained at how to be that particular form of evil. There are folks with, they generally be diagnosed with what we call antisocial personality disorder, but that they were brought to that point by their environment. And the environments are just what you'd think they are, just hideous and bring out the worst in everyone.
Is it nature or nurture?
Well, that's a big chunk of the class. That there are folks whose violent criminal nature is almost exclusively nature. They come that way from the manufacturer. There are folks who are made to be that way, and then there are folks that are somewhere in between. We go a bit in depth about each one of those because they're different kinds of folks, and they offer us a different kind of risk profile. The kind of risk of predatory violence versus explosive violence, let's say. Well, the person who's perpetrating that violence is very, very different. And we talk quite a bit about terrorism, obviously, not because it's like street crime, but because it's a risk that generally accrues to everyone, not just situationally.
If you could give us because the common thought or myth is that, criminals are choosing you have a fancy necklace or you have a fancy car, or you're wearing, I know where your wallet is. That kind of was dispelled throughout the class, but how then are victims choosing their victims or their targets? What are they looking for?
Yeah, the most powerful single dispositive factor, right? The most powerful single factor in choice of who's going to be targeted is gait. How your body moves in space, how you move in space, gives a very quick impression to a violent criminal actor of your suitability as a victim. Now, other things might be, like you said, are you wearing expensive jewelry, right? Those are things that would make an attack on you particularly profitable. Because if you think about it, a street level criminal has to make two judgments. Are you a good victim? And second, will they get what they're after? The worst case scenario for let's say a mugger, so to speak, is what we call a false positive. To go ahead and mug somebody and they don't have any money. It's the worst possible outcome because they ran all the risks, getting arrested, getting killed by you, etc. And there's no yield. You didn't have any money. So if you can avoid one of those, if you can avoid wearing expensive stuff, if you can avoid ostentatious displays of wealth, sure, that's probably a good idea because you remove one of the choice elements in play. But the overriding judgment is, are you a good victim? As one guy that I got to interview in jail put it, are you hard or are you soft? If you're hard, they'll pass you up. If you're soft, it's on.
Talk to us a little bit more about, maybe to those folks who don't understand what a gate is, and go into a little bit more detail about that, and if you don't mind, of course, if you don't want to.
No, not at all.
What about their gait are they looking for?
Gait, how a person walks is incredibly data rich. It's some of the most boring research you'll ever read. I literally have to read it standing up, and I'm not kidding about that. It will put you to sleep in a heartbeat. But there's tons of research about how gait drives victim selection, because it is so many kinds of data compressed into one. There's research to show that people are able to use gait to determine prior victim status, meaning has the person been victimized before? And also, of course, gait is a head-to-toe physical snapshot. Gaits that are odd, limps, things like that, draw immediate attention. And this is relevant for all of us because sooner or later, we're going to have a bad walk. We just are. We're going to get old, we're going to get sick, we're going to get hurt. It's just the way the world is. And having a gait that's distinctly abnormal, that's objectively odd, draws the attention of people that are using it as a global measure of how good of a fight could you put up. So we have to know, the point is to have awareness of our gait, that my gait puts me in a higher risk pool. I need to prepare for that. Right? I need to recognize when I walk out of the house that I'm in a higher risk pool because of my limp, because of my injury, because of my foot drop, because of my unsteady gait, whatever it is. We have to recognize that puts us in a higher risk pool and start taking measures to account for that.
That makes sense. Thank you. Andy, I think, Andy, you're up.
Oh, okay. I thought Judson was going to ask his questions there. So, Scott, with your experience in both armed and unarmed self-defense, Jeremy mentioned earlier that there was a little bit of kind of some bonus training at the end of the class. What was that about?
There were some strategies for managing an unknown person approaching you. Also some strategies for firearm retention, some tactics, some techniques for that. It's interesting watching people do that. It's not the first time I've watched something like that, but it's one of the things that's most interesting to me. When William is giving this part of the course to people and trying to get them to put a verbal and psychological and physical kind of barrier space between them and somebody who's potentially if not a threat, at least an unknown, and how unnatural it is sometimes for people to do this, because they're conditioned to being nice and being rude, or some people will even avert their eyes rather than make eye contact with somebody that makes them nervous. And this was a great kind of follow up and bonus section to the course.
Yeah, it's I found it so many times. There were in a lot of cases that turn out to be assaults, there was a moment where the assault could have been forestalled, where there could have been dissuasion, but people are not able to project force. And one of the things I said, and Scott will certainly remember me saying it, is if you can't project force in space, you may have to use force. But that's a tough thing to get people to do, because nice people aren't used to trying to order people around. Are not used to trying to manipulate others in space and control space with their voice or physical presence. And the funny thing is, people find it more uncomfortable than getting physical, which is pretty interesting to me, that being verbal is a greater challenge for people than being physical a lot of times. One thing that was great about Scott's group was that nobody was without ideas physically. You could tell that they had done a lot of good work about retaining weapons and taking weapons away from people, so that they had a great foundation to lead into it. Because sometimes a lot of folks in my class will start absolutely ground zero at that point. But managing people in space, especially unknown people, people where there's a high degree of uncertainty about is this a threat or not. And again, one of the best courses for learning to do that is Craig Douglas's class, Managing Unknown Contacts. Goes into a great deal of depth about the same thing, all the way from from passing in space to hands-on. Great class.
So, William, why do you offer that bonus training at the end?
I used to offer it in the middle as a way to get people moving around. But what I found is that, if you make the day too long, there has to be sort of a regular break point. I mean, people have lives. I get it. They have kids and babysitters and commitments they have to go to, and to get a whole 8-hour block out of people's day is really an extraordinary commitment. And so to keep it a reasonable length, I moved that section to the end and make it optional. My feelings are not going to be hurt if you've got to go. I get it. People have real lives, and I don't want to ever be flip about, oh, if I'm still here, you have to stay. If the babysitter goes off the clock at 5, I have to get you out of there by 5, right? That's the deal. So I put it at the end of the day and make it optional, recognizing that if people want to stay, that's great. But if they can't, I understand.
I think the importance is of that training for some of the folks that attend your seminar. Maybe not the ones that have gone through some training with Scott or other unarmed self-defense or that physical stuff, but what's the importance of that bonus material?
I think it's important in that it's knitting together really the kind of 3 nodes that are interesting to me. Threat detection, right? I've noticed this person and they've gotten my attention. And then starting to intervene at distances further than you normally think you would. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in that section of the class is setting your bubble, which means how close does somebody have to be before they get your undivided attention. And when we first start off doing people will set bubbles at 5 feet, 3 feet, whereas mine is extraordinarily large. I start setting it as big as it can be, 30 yards if I could, because the person's gotten my attention and I want to start intervening on them as early as possible so that I can increase my confidence. Is this person a threat or not? Because the point of an unknown contact is I need more confidence one way or the other. And so it's active ways of getting information from that person that let me know threat or non-threat, threat or non-threat. And so manipulating people in space is really about seeking information, because that information lets me be more confident in my decision one way or another.
Yeah, that's good answers there. So for the average person that wants to come to your class, William, how do I prepare for this?
Oh, just show up. It's not the kind of class that you can sort of spin up for or, get ready for. If you come with an open mind and certainly willing to share your own life experiences, because there's a bunch of points in the class where people's experience fed into the material is what's important. And that's my favorite part, is when people bring a life experience and say, oh, that same thing happened to me, and give another example. It makes it easier for me to kind of have it be enriched in that way.
Do you do any YouTube videos or anything? A lot of times, like we went to humble brag, we went to Clint Smith's training in Oregon, and I spent pretty much a whole week just watching his YouTube videos to try to get an idea. So was there any kind of do you have any kind of videos like that?
There will be this year. We're starting in 2018. There'll be a series of there'll be a series of interview sort of format, and then some other set piece videos coming out this year. And hopefully throughout the course of the year, we'll get pretty regular at doing that.
So I've got a question that it's a little bit off topic from what we've been talking about, but it's kind of circling back to something we were talking about earlier. We in the gun industry and the training industry, as instructors and all that stuff, we do a pretty good job of kind of showing what the concealed carry person should look like and how they should act. And that, when we teach our concealed carry classes, we teach all the laws and all the don't do this kind of things. Don't carry here, carry there kind of things where you can and can't. Can you kind of describe to us what the crime or the violent criminal looks like from the criminal's mind, from their perspective? What does that violent crime look like?
Oh, I can tell you this. Scott will probably laugh because I say this many times during the lecture. everyone is the hero in their own story. Violent criminal actors don't walk around saying, oh, I'm such a bad guy. I do all this terrible stuff. I rob the people. This is terrible. What a jerk. When you talk to violent criminal actors, they'll describe what they do in incredibly benign and global terms. I can't tell you how many times I've been told, I'm just doing what I do. I'm just putting in work. I'm just trying to get paid. And even, I'm just trying to feed my kids. Well, those are exactly the same things we would say if somebody said, what do you do on a daily basis? Hey, I'm just doing what I do. I'm just putting in work. Just trying to get paid, trying to feed my kids. They're not bad guys in their own story. And a lot of what they practice we would call victim-initiated violence, where they find a way in their minds, working around so that the victim of their assault is actually the person to blame for their assault. And it's a nifty way of passing along the blame to the victim. But it's to preserve that notion that they are indeed a good guy. Remember, to them, you're the bad guy. You're not the good guy. You're the bad guy. When you interfere with what they're trying to do, like get my kids fed, why would you interfere with that? That's something a bad guy would do. So when we try and do weird little things like defend ourselves, that makes us the bad guy in their world. It's all about preservation of self-concept, we call it. And believe me, to them, they're not the bad guys.
Wow, that's an incredible take on that, because I never would have thought that you've gone down that road, as far as, that blows me away.
Yeah, because if you think about it, when you look at them, the danger is that you see them through your eyes, right? And what they do is incredibly illegitimate. There's no reasonable basis for what they do. So they're bad guys. Well, nobody likes to think of themselves as doing things that are indefensible. We always find a reason to do it. Think about, good Lord, think about Nazis at Nuremberg, the classic Nuremberg defense. Hey, I'm not a bad guy. I was just following orders. Insane. On its face, completely insane. But that's what people will do to preserve their self-concept. And street level criminals are just the same.
Yeah, there's an exercise that William does at the end of did at the end of this seminar that really wrapped up the 8.5 hours of training that I received. And Judson, it goes directly to that aha moment that you had. And in the exercise leading up to it, I was just like, man, I felt like I was starting to have a snowflake moment. I don't know if that's PC or not, but I was starting to get kind of pissed off in my seat. And then William finishes it up and he's like, that rage that you feel right now, that anger that you feel right now, that's the exact same way the violent criminal actor feels when you interfere with their plan, with their moral code, with what they're doing to provide for themselves and their family. And then I was like, oh man, this is real stuff. This is real life. This is serious. And for them, it's the way we kind of wrap our mind around what we would do to defend ourselves and our loved ones. They're willing to do the same thing to defend themselves and their loved ones and their way of life. And it's kind of wrapped up, and it kind of connected some training that I received, the force on force training that I took. And it was I was like, okay, stop being a baby about it and understand what's going on here. And so Scott, Judson, when you take that seminar, it'll become an even bigger aha moment for you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Is that we tend to think that since we don't share their moral viewpoint, we see their moral viewpoint as illegitimate. Well, how invested can anyone be in a completely illegitimate moral viewpoint? Well, they don't view it as illegitimate. So they're as invested in their moral viewpoint as you are invested in your moral viewpoint, 100%. And if you offer token resistance to somebody who's 100% invested in attacking you, you'll get killed.
Absolutely. So aside from the Unthinkable seminar and what we've talked about tonight, Scott, what general advice do you have for gun owners or the responsibly armed citizen?
General advice. Well, I guess if I had to generalize, I would say get as much realistic and varied training as you can. one of the reasons I'm thrilled to bring someone like William into the school, or Cecil Birch or Rick Blitzstein's going to be here this weekend, is to give him a different perspective, and hear it from hear different experiences and different knowledge from lots of different people. We tend to kind of silo. What I don't want my students looking at me the way students look at their instructor, right? You become all-knowing, all-seeing, and everything you say is gold. No, that's not what I want. I want them to be challenged. I want the things that I teach them to be challenged, right? I want them to decide what's good and what's not. And, I think that's the best advice we can give anybody is try to look at this from as many angles as possible, and take enough training so that when you're getting good stuff and when you're not.
That's a great point. I think that's a great point. I think a lot of instructors would get a little overprotective, that we're worried, geez, if somebody takes something bad, it might ruin them. If you take something bad, I mean, believe me, we can all look back in our training histories and see something that we just can't believe we took. But the simple fact is, knowing what not to believe in is important too. And so to get out and get training from all kinds of different people, even if you pick a lemon every now and again, I think it informs the training process and makes it deeper and broader. I'm always leery of people that have taken 20 courses with one instructor. They probably would have been better off, even if you love that guy, taking 15 of those with some other people. Mm-hmm.
Great advice. William, same question to you. Outside of the Unthinkable seminar, what general advice do you have for gun owners?
Don't get high in your own supply. No. I think general advice is to make the big decisions first. I often get people who immediately jump into technical or technistic decisions. What kind of guns, what kind of holsters, what kind of stuff like that. The big decision first. Are you morally comfortable using lethal force? Time spent exploring that is never time wasted. I mean, when you put on, Tom Givens puts it very well. When you put on that gun, you are saying, I reserve the right to kill people under limited circumstances, under circumscribed conditions. You better be okay with that. Because if you can't morally justify something in your own head, if you can't contemplate something fully within your own head, you won't be able to do it. When the crisis comes, you won't be able to do it. So thinking about the big picture, I know it seems kind of silly, but it's incredibly important. It's easy to get caught up in the little stuff, and shooting is fun, and guns are fun, and all that stuff is fun. But the inescapable reality is that we're taking upon ourselves the power to use lethal force, and we've got to think that through in all the dimensions, because even if you do it successfully, you've still got to live with yourself. And so work done in advance of that is never wasted. And in fact, it's something most people don't do and ought to.
That's great advice. Let's kick it back over to Andy and Jetson. Andy, what advice do you have for our listeners?
I'd like to redact my beginning statement when Jeremy said, hey, I took this course. It was 8.5 hours. I could do it 8.5 or 9 more hours. And I said, man, I don't know if I could do that many hours. Just sitting here listening to you, William, and hearing all the responses bouncing off of Jeremy that took the class and Scott that took the class. Sign me up. If you want to come back out here sooner, I'm sure Scott would be more than happy to get you into his classroom to where we can go take your class a lot sooner, and then we'll take it again in 6 months. So, I want to redact my previous statement. So this was a really interesting conversation. I honestly wish we had another hour to talk about it. There was 100 things running through my mind that we could talk about, and victims and criminals and, things that we say and things that we see and commonalities. It's just a really good conversation. So thank you, William, for your time. I appreciate it. And Scott, as always, appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it.
No, thanks, guys.
And it really does. This hour for our listeners and for us on here, this really only began to scratch the first layer of everything that that is in that class and in that seminar. Andy asked earlier if, there's what do you have on YouTube? What do you have out there? That way we can start looking into you and a little bit more. And everything that I've watched a couple other interviews with William. It really doesn't do the seminar the justice that the seminar is. Judson, what about you? What advice do you have for our listeners?
Everybody should get a haircut like Scott. Honestly, William kind of stole my thunder. I was going to go into that whole rabbit hole there, but so I think what I'm going to say is just a segue off of that is just, and the segue off of that being when you walk out the door, you've got to make that decision the second you strap that gun on. And without going into the details, it ended up being nothing. It was a stranger that walked into my house mistakenly. They walked out before I got to them, but I had gun in hand at 12:30 at night, and the adrenaline dump that I had was immense. But I was literally saying to myself, am I actually going to have to shoot somebody right now? Because I made that decision to protect my wife and my dogs years ago. So make that choice. But what I would leave people with is, based on everything we've talked about and everything that we've learned here, is be situationally aware. Be aware of what's around you. Be aware of who's walking in the door, behind you. Be aware of how close that person is behind you at the 7-Eleven. Be aware of is the guy behind you driving? Is he driving too close? Get space, all that stuff. Just be aware of your surroundings and be aware of what's going on around you. Don't be that head in the sand kind of, walking down the street doing this, typing on your cell phone kind of thing. That would be my parting advice based on what I've just heard on everything that's been on this podcast. Awesome.
Well, we appreciate everybody jumping on and listening. We appreciate William, you taking the time. Scott, as always, you guys jumping on with us. The insight and knowledge that you provide our listeners is invaluable. We look forward to having William back in Albuquerque and hopefully on the After Action Project again. If there's an instructor that you guys know of that you'd like to have on the After Action Project, send us an email or message. We'd love to have them on there. And you guys have a great night and stay safe. Sorry, guys. The struggle is real with me right now.